Hey everyone, Varric here. So today's video is going to be on Shen, the final boss in the Throne of Thunder. Now with being the final boss in this raid instance, there's a lot of stuff to go over. This is a rather complicated fight. There's a lot of abilities that need to be covered. So this video might run a little long, and I apologize for that, but I want to be as thorough as I can, but without obviously putting anybody to sleep, so I just ask that you bear with me. Now this is a three-phase fight. However, it's not your typical three-phase fight. What I mean by that is you won't immediately transition from phase 1 to phase 2 and phase 2 to phase 3. There's actually what they call transition phase in between phase 1 and phase 2 and phase 2 and phase 3. So you'll have to deal with that intermission phase, so to speak, before you transfer to the next phase. So it won't be instantaneous. So it's just important that you understand that. Secondly, before the fight starts, I recommend you do a couple of things. Firstly, if you look around the room, you notice there's 4 large conduits. I definitely recommend putting your colored raid markers on the ground as visual cues, and this will come into play during the transition phase. Secondly, you want to break up your raid team into 4 groups, and this is for 10-man. You want to break your team up into 2 teams of 2 players and 2 teams of 3 players. And then assign those players whatever colored conduit or whatever color raid marker you feel comfortable with. And again, this comes into play during the transition phase. So it's very important that each person knows where they need to go once the transition phases start. Now, at the end of the first transition phase, one of the conduits will be disabled. So that means in the second transition phase, whoever was in that particular quadrant will have to be dispersed into the other 3 quadrants. So it's important to know whoever was in that particular quadrant knows where they need to go to. You need to spread that group out between the other groups. So phase 1 transition phase, everybody needs to know where to go for that particular transition phase. And then once the second transition phase, whichever quadrant you decide to disable, that group will have to know where to go in the second one. So it's going to be different from the first transition phase and the second transition phase. So it's very important everybody knows there's assignments. Now each conduit has a different ability each time Shen is within close range of them. The north conduit has an ability called Static Shock. This will place a debuff on a random raid member. After 8 seconds, this ability will basically deal 1,000,000 damage within anybody who's within 8 yards of that player. Obviously, if you're by yourself and you don't have some ability to negate this, you'll die. Luckily for us, being a hunter, we do have an ability to do that, and it's called Deterrence. If you get Static Shock on, you can just pop Deterrence, let the ability go off, and you won't have to worry about it at all. In fact, it'll save your raid a lot of raid damage that way. Basically, you just want the ability to count down to around 3 or so, pop Deterrence, let the ability go off, and then go back to doing whichever you were doing. But if for some reason your Deterrence is on cooldown, or anybody else gets the Static Shock ability that cannot do the same thing, you need to stack up, because this does about 1,000,000 damage, and that has to be spread out over the different players. Otherwise, if somebody can't negate it, they'll die. So it's very important to stack up if you don't have an ability to obviously negate the effect. The East Conduit's ability is called Diffusion Chain. This is a chain lightning kind of ability. And each person that the chain lightning will jump to, every time that it jumps, it will do more damage. So it's important to stay spread out anytime you're in the East Conduit's quadrant. Also, at the same time, every time that this ability jumps, it will spawn an ad called a Diffuse Lightning. So this is why it's important, otherwise, not just for the damage to stay spread out over the raid, but to keep these ads down to a minimum, because you don't want to have a bunch of ads to deal with while you're dealing with Shen's abilities at the same time. So anytime you're within the East Quadrant, just stay spread out to keep these ads to a minimum. The South Conduit's ability is called Overcharge. This will place a debuff on a random raid member for 6 seconds, and they will become rooted. At the end of the 6 seconds, a large electrical ring will expand out from them. Anybody caught within this charge will become stunned for 3 seconds and take a decent amount of damage. The strat is anytime whoever becomes overcharged, you just want to run to them and stand on top of them till the ability goes off. That way you won't get stunned and you won't take the damage. So just make sure you pay attention to whoever gets overcharged and run over to them. If you get overcharged, you can still attack, you just can't move. So just keep that in mind. Now the last conduit, or the West conduit, has an ability called Bouncing Bolt. Basically what this ability do is spawn random blue vortexes on the ground. It's imperative that anybody that can needs to stand in these blue vortexes. Usually there's 2 to 3 of these in the beginning of the fight. So just make sure at least one person is standing in these blue conduits. Or excuse me, the blue vortexes. Now, if you're just one person standing in this, you're going to take a little bit of damage. It's not going to kill you as long as you're not already low health, so it should be easily survivable. But if you can get multiple people standing in it, then more the better. Now, if for some reason nobody is standing in this blue vortex when the ball hits the ground, 2 things are going to happen. One, it's just going to keep bouncing around the room. So somebody eventually has to catch it, or it'll just keep bouncing. And this is very dangerous because of the second reason, and that is every time that the ball hits the ground, it will spawn an ad called a Unharnessed Power. Now, unlike the Diffuse Lightning ads, these ads have a lot of HP, and they deal a decent amount of melee damage, so it's very, very important that you never let these balls hit the ground. It's probably not an instant raid wipe if one should spawn, depending really on where you are in the fight, but I highly recommend not letting that happen. It's just something else you're going to have to deal with. Now, on top of each of the conduit's abilities, you're going to have to deal with a couple of different abilities in Phase 1. The first being Thunderstruck. This will just spawn a giant lightning vortex on the ground. After, I believe it's 4 maybe 5 seconds, Lei Shen will kind of toss his spear into the center of this vortex and it will explode. If you're anywhere near this, you're going to take a lot of damage, and if you're standing really close to it, you're going to die. So it's very, very important that you run away from it when you see it. The further away from it you are, the less damage you take. However, if for some reason you either can't run away from it or you're feeling really brave, you can deterrence it completely. Just count to around 3 or so and then pop deterrence, and then you won't have to worry about the damage, and then just cancel aura and then go back to attacking. I don't recommend doing this towards the end of the Phase 1 or Phase 2, as you really want to have your deterrence off cooldown going into the transition phases, but you're just going to have to play that by ear. If you can run away from it though, just try. Now the second ability is called Crashing Thunder. This is really just a minor annoyance to deal with. It just spawns random damaging void zones on the ground. They last for 45 seconds or so, so they eventually do go away. Just like a little purple goo or purple stuff on the ground you can just avoid easily, so just don't run over them. Now Phase 1 will end once Lei Shen hits 65%, and then you will head into the first transition phase. However, I'd like to go over the actual strat for the first phase. Your goal is to have one of the conduits higher than the others without powering any of the conduits up, because every time they power up, as I said earlier, although the abilities that they do, whichever conduit levels up, that will deal more damage. You definitely don't want to deal with that during your first transition phase. More than likely, and if you're following this video strat, you're going to start on the East conduit. And the goal should be to get the conduit's energy to around 90 or so. I wouldn't recommend going much higher than that. And then just make either a clockwise or counterclockwise. It'll just depend on which one you want to go. And then as you're making your way around to the other conduits, try not to get them any higher than, say, 70 to 75. Now, it might be a little higher as long as you don't go above the East conduit's energy, above 90 or whatever. Depending on your raid DPS, you may have to get them to 75 or even 80 to 85 if you have to. Just don't cut it that close, because you definitely want to have the East conduit with the higher energy. The reason being is, at the end of the first transition phase, whichever conduit has the highest amount of energy will be disabled. And you will actually not deal with that conduit's abilities for the rest of the fight. On top of that, that quadrant of the conduit that's disabled will become, you won't be able to stand in that quadrant. The whole floor will become electrified. So just make sure you really set your goal to make sure that the East conduit is the highest energy into Phase 1. That way it'll be the one that you know it's going to be destroyed at the end of the first transition phase. Now, as I said earlier, once Lei Shen gets 65%, the first transition phase will start, and he will teleport to the center of the room. At this point, all 4 conduits will become powered up, and this first transition phase will last 45 seconds. And this is where your raid team will have to split up into whatever groups you assign them. Now, you're going to have to deal with all of the conduits' abilities at the same time, meaning you're going to have to deal with static shocks, the diffused lightnings, the bouncing balls, and the unharnessed power adds if you're too close together. It's very, very important for the first transition phase to stay spread out if you are destroying the east conduit adds first. But it's important again to stack up for overcharge, static shock if you can't deterrence it, and for the bouncing ball, make sure you're definitely stacking up for those. You don't want those to spawn those adds. This is a part of the fight that you don't want to deal with the adds. It's not the end of the world if 1 or maybe even 2 spawn, really depending on your raid. If your DPS is decent enough, they can actually kill it, hopefully before the next phase. If that's not possible, then maybe just misdirect the add to one of the tanks and let them deal with it until the next phase starts, and that way you can just AoE it down if that becomes a problem. But just try to refrain from that happening. Now, once the 45 seconds are over, you will now enter the phase 2. At this point, you will not be dealing with the east conduit, so you will not have to worry about the diffused lightning adds anymore. And you will also not be dealing with Thunderstruck or the Crashing Thunder Void Zones during this particular phase 2. However, you will be dealing with 2 new abilities in phase 2. The first being Summon Ball Lightning, where he will summon a ball lightning for each of the raid members. When they spawn, they will deal nature damage within 6 yards, so it's important to stay spread out during this part. As soon as they spawn, though, you want to group up and then AoE these little adds down. They're little ball lightning adds. Otherwise, they're just going to start zipping around and start doing random damage. They're not inherently dangerous by themselves, but obviously a large group of them will start to just drain your healer's mana. So just stay spread out. Once they spawn, group up, AoE the adds down, and then go back to attacking the boss. The second ability that he will do is called Lightning Whip. This will spawn a rather large, storm cloud graphic on the ground. After a few seconds, this lightning bolt pattern on the ground will appear. If you step on any of these lightning lines, they will deal a decent amount of damage, and just try to refrain from walking over it if you can. So it's also very important to make sure you get out of it before it goes off, because it will deal a decent amount of damage if you get caught in it. For some reason, though, if you can't run out of it in time, or you feel like you're not going to make it out of the storm cloud graphic before the lightning whip actually activates, you can deterrence it and then just run out and not worry about taking any damage. But that's kind of a last resort. Just try to get used to running away from the lightning whip. Now, unlike phase 1, you're only going to be dealing with 3 conduits, which means there's a pretty high chance that one of the conduits is going to power up. Especially your first few attempts when your DPS is probably a little on the low side. It's really going to depend on your raid strengths on which of the conduits you're willing to power up first. If you have a lot of classes that can negate the static shock effect, it's probably recommended. But again, you're going to be dealing with more of the damage from it. However, because one of the quadrants is disabled, you're going to have more people in each of the groups, so that means the damage can be spread out. So you could do it that way. That's really up to your raid strengths and what you guys decided to experiment with. But again, you're just going to have to make a circuit around the 3 conduits. Now, it becomes very important if you did decide to do the east quadrant, or the east conduit, and disabled it, that you disable one of the conduits next to it. Meaning that half of the room, once that second conduit has the higher amount of energy going into the second transition phase, once the final phase starts, you're basically going to end up with one half of the room disabled, which means you're not going to be able to use that half of the room. So it becomes very important to make sure you pick the right conduit next to the east quadrant to disable, so that one half of the room is done, so it leaves you the whole half of the other room to use. Otherwise, if you disable the wrong conduit, say maybe the west conduit and the east conduit, it's going to make it very difficult for you to do the final phase with having to dance, on a different quadrant instead of half the room. So it's just important that you make sure you keep probably the north or south conduit at the highest energy going into the second transition phase. Now the second phase will end once he reaches 30% HP. And then you'll have a repeat of the first transition phase basically, except you won't be dealing with one of the conduit's abilities. So things become slightly easier just because you're dealing with one less ability, especially if you did the East conduit. You're not going to have to worry about the adds anymore, so you can stack up pretty much for everything. But if you did power up one of the conduits, you're going to have to worry about the increased damage. So just keep that in mind. But just like the first transition phase, the second will last 45 seconds. Then that conduit's quadrant will become disabled, so you're now dealing with only half of the room if you did it right. Now moving into phase 3, you're going to have to be dealing with a combination of abilities. You're going to be dealing with Thunderstruck from phase 1, and you're going to be dealing with Summon Ball Lightning and Lightning Whip from phase 2. You're also going to be dealing with a new ability called Violent Gale Winds. What this will do is that during intermittent parts of the last phase, this large gust of wind is going to start blowing your raid around in just random directions. But on top of this, the winds are going to start doing damage to your raid. At first, it's not very difficult. It's not a lot of damage. However, each gale winds that goes by, it gives you a stacking debuff, meaning that the next gale wind is going to do more damage, and then so on and so forth. So it does become a race against time to get Lei Shen down. Otherwise, the gale winds are going to start doing too much damage, and your healers aren't going to be able to keep up. Again, you're still going to be dealing with Thunderstruck, so if you can get away from it, do. But again, you're only going to have half the room to deal with. So if for some reason, if you're too close or you can't run away, just pop deterrence, eat it, and then just go back to attacking Lei Shen. Same thing with Lightning Whip. If you're getting blown into it, which happens on occasion, just pop deterrence, let it go off, and then get out. Summon Ball Lightning, same thing. Try to stay as spread out as you can. And then once they spawn, group up, AoE the adds down, and then spread back out a little bit. But that's pretty much it for the fight. I realize it sounds like there's a lot, and there is a kind of a lot to go over. But hopefully this video was helpful enough and thorough enough. If I left something out, or if you have any questions or concerns or comments, just leave them down in the comment section down below, and I'll be happy to answer them. But that's going to do it for this video. I appreciate you guys watching, and I'll try to get the heroic videos going. I have some heroic content videos coming, but I want to get this last one out for Lei Shen, as this is a pretty long video. But as always, I appreciate you guys watching, and I will see you later.